Silence. A silence so deep it seemed to swallow the world. The city of Rome, once the beating heart of civilization, lay in uneasy sleep beneath a cold and moonless sky. No one knew it yet, but history was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when one of humanity's greatest empires would collapse not with a roar, but with a whisper. The air itself felt heavy, as if it knew that something ancient was about to die. Beyond the city walls, campfires flickered like dying stars, stretching across the hills where Alaric's Visigoth army waited. Thousands of men, hardened by hunger and years of betrayal, their armor dull, their faces set, eyes fixed on the sleeping city before them. They had come from the edges of the world, where Rome's power had once reached like a shadow, and now that shadow had grown thin, for centuries, Rome had ruled with iron and arrogance, taking gold, land, and blood from every corner of its empire. And now, those who had once bowed to its might stood ready to take it all back. Inside the city, the streets were empty, broken stones echoing faintly beneath the steps of a few restless souls. The markets that once overflowed with noise and color now lay dark and abandoned. The once proud Roman legions were gone, scattered and weary. The senators who once decided the fate of nations now whispered behind closed doors, wondering if the dawn would come at all. At the palace, the young Emperor Honorius sat alone, barely more than a boy, surrounded by riches he could not protect, staring into the flicker of a single candle, knowing that his empire was slipping from his grasp. And then, as the night deepened, a wind rose, cold and sharp, carrying the faint sound of horns from the distance. It was not the sound of ceremony or triumph, it was the sound of something ending, the kind of sound that makes the blood turn cold. Dogs began to bark in the alleys, the river Tiber whispered against the stone bridges, and somewhere in the distance, a single torch went out. The darkness swallowed it whole, and Rome, the eternal city, stood on the edge of its final night. The night stretched on, heavy and unbroken. Above the sleeping city, the clouds hung low, pressing the weight of centuries down upon the rooftops. Rome had known darkness before, but this felt different. This was not the calm of night. It was the stillness before something breaks. In the narrow streets, shadows moved between shuttered homes. Whispers carried from one doorway to another. People spoke in hurried tones, asking if the rumors were true, if the barbarian king was truly waiting just beyond the walls. Some said it was only fear, others said it was fate. In a small house near the Forum, an old soldier sat awake, his armor long rusted, his sword hanging by the door. He had served in the days when the empire still meant something, when its banners carried pride instead of dust. He could feel it in his bones. The city was breathing its last. His wife urged him to sleep, but he couldn't. He just stared at the window, waiting for the sound that every Roman feared to hear, the clash of the gates falling, the roar of a city being taken. At the palace, the emperor's advisors argued in circles, some pleaded for negotiation, others demanded resistance, but no one could agree. The gold that once bought loyalty now bought only hesitation. The messengers had stopped returning. The generals who promised to bring reinforcements had vanished into silence. Honorius sat quietly, his hands trembling. He was the emperor of a dying world, and he knew. In the still darkness before dawn, the city began to stir, not with the noise of life, but with the uneasy shuffle of fear. From the poorest huts to the marble halls, people whispered prayers to gods who no longer seemed to listen. The air was cold and damp, carrying the smell of smoke from distant fires outside the walls. Every creak of wood and echo of footsteps sounded like an omen in the narrow alleys. Stray dogs barked and then went silent, as if they too sensed what was coming. The old soldier who had kept watch through the night finally rose, his back aching, his hands shaking as he gripped the sword he thought he would never raise again. He stepped out into the street and looked toward the city gates. The faint glow of morning revealed a haze of dust beyond them, not from merchants or travelers, but from the movement of an army. He whispered a single word under his breath. It was not fear, it was recognition. He had seen this before, in faraway lands when he had been the one standing outside the walls. In the Forum, the merchants who had not fled gathered their remaining goods, gold, silver, anything that could buy mercy if the gates fell. Mothers clutched their children close. Priests lit candles that flickered wildly in the wind. One by one, the temples that once echoed with chants now stood hollow. The statues of the gods looked down from their pedestals with eyes carved from stone, indifferent and cold. The empire that had built them no longer had the faith to believe in them. In the palace, Honorius sat in silence as the sound of distant horns began to rise, low and mournful. The senators around him fell quiet. No one needed to speak. They all knew what those horns meant. The enemy was no longer waiting. The Visigoths were moving. The end that had been creeping slowly for years was finally at the gate. The emperor wanted to speak, to command, to show strength. But no words came. He simply lowered his head, his crown heavy on his brow, and whispered to no one in particular, "Perhaps this is how gods die, not in battle, but in silence." Beyond the walls, Alaric raised his arm, the wind catching his cloak, his face calm, almost sorrowful. He had no hatred left for Rome, only purpose. His men waited for his signal. Their torches burned brighter as the sky began to lighten. The first birds stirred in the trees, unaware that the city before them stood at the edge of oblivion. And then, without a word, Alaric let his hand fall. The horns sounded again, louder this time, deep and final, like the heartbeat of an empire that was about to stop. The first horn sounded like a ghost's cry, low and distant, but it carried through every narrow street and hollow corridor of Rome. The people froze, the guards at the gates gripped their spears tighter, and even the wind seemed to pause. The Visigoths had begun to move, shadows shifting beyond the walls, their silhouettes flickering in the light of their torches. They came not as soldiers of conquest, but as men driven by hunger and vengeance. For years they had watched the empire that once ruled them decay from within. Now they were here to claim what was left. In the barracks near the gate, a few remaining Roman soldiers scrambled to their posts, their armor dented, their weapons dull. They looked to their captain, a man too old for war and too young to die. His voice broke the silence. "Hold the gate, no matter what," he said. Though his eyes betrayed the truth, he knew they would not hold it. He could feel the weight of history pressing down. This was not a battle to be won. It was a moment to be remembered, when courage would meet futility under a trenching, dying flag. Beyond the walls, Alaric rode at the head of his men, his face calm, his eyes fixed on the city before him. He could see the faint shimmer of torches along the walls. He could almost feel the fear within. He had once fought for Rome, had bled for its promise, and been cast aside like dust. Tonight, he was not seeking revenge, only resolution. He raised his hand, and the army behind him went silent. Tens of thousands of men waiting for a single word, a single gesture that would decide the fate of the empire that had ruled for centuries. In the city, the churches filled with trembling voices. Priests called for mercy, but their words felt hollow. In the palace, the senators gathered one last time, dressed in robes of silk that could not hide the fear in their faces. One man rose, his voice shaking. "Perhaps it is better that it ends," he said. "Better that the world begin anew." No one answered him. No one could. They all knew he was right. The empire had been dying for a long time. This night was only the end of its final breath. As the second horn sounded, louder and closer, the old soldier stepped into the street, his sword drawn. The dawn was breaking now, pale and cold, light touching the high towers of the city. He looked up at them, remembering what they had once meant, what they had once stood for. And in that moment he understood. Rome was not falling because of an enemy. It was falling because it had forgotten what it was meant to protect. The sound of footsteps grew louder, the air trembled, and as the third horn echoed through the city, the gates of Rome began to shake. The sound of the third horn rolled through the streets like thunder. The gates shuddered beneath the weight of what pressed against them, every bolt and bar groaning as if the city itself were crying out. The guards at the walls stood frozen, their hands trembling, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had seen wars before, rebellions and invasions, but this felt different. This felt final, on the other side of the gate. The Visigoths waited in silence, the stillness before the storm. Their leader Alaric sat atop his horse, staring at the ancient walls, his breath misting in the cold morning air. For him this was not conquest, it was destiny fulfilled. Inside the city, panic began to spread like fire. People rushed through the streets carrying whatever they could, gold, bread, relics, it didn't matter. Mothers clutched their children, priests shouted prayers into the wind, the sound of weeping echoed through the narrow alleys. The sky above the city began to lighten, the first rays of dawn creeping through the clouds. But there was no warmth in that light, only the pale glow of an ending. The city that had once ruled the world now trembled, beneath the weight of its own history. At the palace, Honorius was gone. His advisors had urged him to flee days before, and now the Emperor of Rome sat miles away in safety, leaving his city to its fate. In his absence, the senators tried to keep order, sending messages to the walls, offering gold and peace in exchange for mercy, but no one was listening. The soldiers at the gates could hear the pounding on the other side, the clash of shields, the roar of voices rising. It was the sound of inevitability, the sound of the end. Beyond the gates, Alaric lowered his hand, and the world seemed to exhale. The Visigoths surged forward, a wall of men and iron. The battering ram struck the gate once, twice, 3 times, each impact shaking the earth. The city's defenses, already weak from years of neglect, began to splinter. Dust fell from the ancient stone, and cracks spread like veins through the walls. On the fourth strike, the old hinges gave way with a scream of metal, and the gate of Rome, that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, finally broke. The soldiers inside fell back, shouting. Some dropped their weapons, others ran, only a few stayed to fight, their swords flashing weakly in the dim light. But it didn't matter. The Visigoths poured through the opening like a flood, their shouts echoing off the marble, their boots trampling the symbols of an empire that had once called itself eternal. In that moment, the city of Rome, the heart of the ancient world, no longer belonged to itself. The empire that had once conquered nations now bowed to the passage of time, and the night the Roman Empire finally fell had truly begun. The moment the gates fell, the sound that followed was not a single cry, but 1,000 voices rising at once, the crash of steel against stone, the roar of men who had waited generations for this night. The Visigoths surged into the city like a tide, their torches lighting the darkness, their boots pounding over marble streets once walked by emperors, statues shattered, doors splintered, and the once proud avenues of Rome filled with the chaos of conquest. Smoke began to curl upward from the lower districts, the smell of burning wood mixing with fear. It was not just a battle, it was the unmaking of an empire. The old soldier watched from the corner of a narrow street, his sword drawn, but his arms too weak to raise it. He saw the enemy pour through the gates, saw Roman soldiers cut down as they tried to defend what was already lost. He wanted to fight, but when he looked around, there was no army left to fight with, only civilians running in panic, slaves screaming, and children hiding beneath fallen walls. The world he had sworn to protect was gone, and in its place stood the raw face of reality. The truth that every empire meets in time, that no wall stands forever. Alaric rode through the gates slowly, his face calm, almost solemn. He looked at the city before him, not as a conqueror, but as a man walking through a memory. The streets were empty except for the dead and the desperate. His men spread through the city, taking gold, food, and vengeance. Some looted the temples, others broke into the houses of nobles, but Alaric did not smile. He had seen too much of war to mistake this ruin for victory. He knew that history would remember him not for what he built, but for what he ended, and in that moment, he felt the weight of centuries pressing on his shoulders. In the Forum, flames climbed high into the air, lighting the night with a red glow. Marble columns cracked under the heat. The sound of breaking glass and shouting voices echoed through the once sacred heart of Rome. Priests fled with relics, some clutching the statues of gods that could not save them. Others fell to their knees, begging for mercy that would not come. The Visigoths, hardened by years of hunger and betrayal, showed little pity. They took what they could and burned the rest, their anger fed by generations of loss. Above it all, the sky began to turn gray with smoke. The sun, just rising, was swallowed by darkness again. The city that had given light to the world now burned beneath its own ashes, and somewhere in the chaos, the old soldier knelt on the ground, his hand pressed against the earth, whispering to no one, "This is not the end, not yet," because he knew that even as the city fell, something of Rome would live on, not in its walls or its kings, but in its memory, carried by the people who would survive this night of fire and ruin.
The fire spread faster than the dawn, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, turning whole districts into waves of smoke and flame. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and oil, with the sharp iron smell of blood. The streets, once echoing with the voices of scholars and poets, now carried only screams, cries for mercy, and the crash of falling stone. The Visigoths moved through the chaos like shadows, their torches casting wild shapes against the walls. Every door broken open revealed treasures and tragedy alike, and above the destruction, the sky glowed red like the reflection of hell itself. In the heart of the city, near the Temple of Jupiter, a small group of Roman citizens gathered, huddled together in fear. An old senator in torn robes tried to calm them, his voice steady but hollow. He spoke of the greatness of Rome, of its unbroken spirit, of how the empire had survived 1,000 storms. But as he spoke, the temple behind him cracked. The great marble statue of Jupiter tilted and fell, shattering into dust. The crowd went silent. The senator stared at the fragments, and in that silence he understood. It was not the gods who had abandoned Rome. It was Rome that had abandoned itself. Alaric rode through the center of the city, his face lit by the flames. His men cheered around him, but he said nothing. He looked at the ruins of the palaces, the broken statues, the torn banners, and felt only emptiness. For years he had dreamed of this moment, but now that it had come, it felt hollow. He had taken the greatest city in the world, and yet the world itself felt smaller, quieter, more fragile, as if something sacred had been broken that could never be repaired. He ordered his men to spare the churches, to leave the poor unharmed. But in the chaos of victory, few listened. The fire had its own will, and mercy was drowned by rage. The old soldier moved through the burning streets, coughing as ash filled his lungs. He passed the ruins of the Forum, the place where he once stood guard,
and now there was nothing left but flame and memory. He saw a young Visigoth dragging a golden statue from a temple, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no hate, no words, just the shared look of two men who had lost everything to the same fire. The old soldier turned away, walking toward the Tiber, the river still glimmering faintly. Beneath the smoke, he could hear the city collapsing behind him, but he did not look back. He could not, because he knew that if he did, he would never move again. As night fell once more over the burning city, the sounds began to fade, the screams quieted, the flames settled into a dull red glow. Rome, the eternal city, lay broken beneath the stars, its empire reduced to ashes. But in that silence, something else began to stir, a whisper carried on the wind, not of defeat, but of remembrance. Because even in ruin, the story of Rome would not die. It would live on in the words, the dreams, and the blood of all who came after. The fires had burned for hours. The sky above the city was black, the stars hidden behind a curtain of smoke. The streets that once shimmered with marble and gold now glowed red with embers. Every building seemed to sigh as it collapsed, sending sparks into the air like dying souls. The air was heavy with ash, and the sound of weeping drifted from every corner. Men, women, and children stumbled through the ruins, faces covered in soot, searching for one another, searching for something that could still be called home. But Rome no longer looked like a city, it looked like a grave. Alaric stood near the ruins of the Forum, watching as his men dragged carts filled with treasures, coins, and relics. They were laughing, shouting, drunk on the feeling of victory, but he remained silent, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes reflecting the glow of the flames. He had done what no man before him had dared. He had broken Rome, but in the hollow of his chest there was no pride, no joy, only the heavy truth that what was lost here could never be rebuilt. He turned to one of his captains and spoke softly. "Enough! The city has fallen. Take what you must, but spare the living. Let them bury their dead, and tell them, Rome will never rise again." Far from the center, near the river Tiber, the old soldier found himself standing before what had once been a church, its doors shattered, its windows broken. But the candles still flickered inside. A priest knelt before the altar, praying beneath the smoke. The soldier stepped forward and sat beside him. For a long moment neither spoke. The priest finally turned, his eyes red from tears. "Do you think God still watches?" he asked. The soldier looked at the burning city and said quietly, "If he does, he is weeping with us." As the hours passed, the chaos began to settle into silence. The Visigoths, their hunger satisfied, withdrew to the outer streets, leaving behind a city that no longer belonged to anyone. The fires burned lower, and the cries faded into echoes. Rome had fallen, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small ones, each brick, each life, each broken oath adding to the ruin. And in that silence, beneath the smoke and ash, the world shifted. For the first time in centuries, there was no Roman Empire, only the memory of what it had been. The old soldier walked to the riverbank and looked at the reflection of the flames in the water. The Tiber carried them away, tiny sparks floating downstream, disappearing into the dark. He closed his eyes and whispered to the city, "You were eternal once, and maybe you still are, not in stone, not in power, but in the stories that will outlive us all." And as he stood there, listening to the distant crackle of dying fire, he felt the faintest wind on his face, carrying with it the ashes of an empire, and the first quiet breath of a world reborn.
The next morning came without birdsong, without light, only a pale haze that drifted through the smoke. The city was quiet now, too quiet. The kind of silence that comes after something sacred has died. The once proud streets of Rome were buried under dust and ash. Marble statues lay in fragments, broken faces staring up at the sky. Columns that had stood for centuries were cracked and leaning, and everywhere the same question lingered in the air. What happens to the world when its center disappears? Alaric rode slowly through the ruins, his horse's hooves crunching over shattered stone. His men followed behind in silence. They no longer shouted or sang. They simply moved, tired and hollow. Victory felt like a wound that would not close. He looked up at the Palatine Hill where emperors had once ruled the known world. Now it was quiet. The great halls empty, the banners burned, the throne room filled with dust and ghosts. He dismounted and stood there for a long time, his breath heavy, and whispered, "It is done," not as a boast, but as a confession. Down by the Tiber, survivors gathered, women clutching children, old men staring blankly at the water. Some tried to comfort one another, others simply sat in silence, watching the city burn. For them, there was no future, only the unbearable weight of memory. One man dipped his hands into the river, washing away the soot, and when he looked at his reflection, he saw not a Roman citizen, but a relic of a vanished world. The empire that had defined their lives had ended, and no one knew what would come next. The old soldier sat among them, his armor blackened, his sword gone. He listened to the distant crackle of fire,
to the soft sound of the river, and to the faint murmurs of grief. A boy approached him, his face streaked with ash. He asked, "Will they come back? Will Rome rise again?" The soldier looked toward the broken skyline, the temples and towers fading into smoke, and answered, "Not like this, not with kings and armies, but maybe one day, in words, in ideas, in the hearts of those who can." As the day faded, the smoke began to lift, and for the first time in days, a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds. It touched the ruins gently, turning the dust into gold. It was a small, fragile light, but it was enough, because even in ruin, even in loss, the spirit of Rome refused to vanish. It lingered in the air, in the silence, in the people who still breathed. The empire had fallen, but the story had only just begun. By the second night after the fall, the fires had died down to embers, the once blinding glow of destruction replaced by a dim red haze that clung to the air. Rome no longer screamed, it whispered, the streets were lined with ash, and the sound of footsteps echoed far and slow. The Visigoths had taken their spoils and withdrawn to the edges of the city, leaving behind a silence too heavy to bear. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke mixed with the bitterness of blood. The city of gods had become a city of ghosts. Alaric walked alone through the ruins of the Forum, his armor darkened by soot, his cloak torn. He looked up at the columns that still stood, tall but cracked, and he thought of what the city once was, its power, its order, its arrogance, and its beauty. He felt no hatred, only awe, and something close to sorrow. He had broken an empire, but in doing so he had broken a piece of himself. Every conqueror leaves ashes behind, but few realize that those ashes cling to their own soul, he whispered. To the empty air, the gods of Rome are silent, but maybe they still watch. Maybe they wait to see what we build from what we have destroyed. In a quiet part of the city, near the baths of Caracalla, a few families huddled in the ruins, sharing what little food they had. One woman sang softly to her child, her voice cracked but steady. Her song carried over the broken walls like a prayer. The old soldier passed by and stopped to listen. It was a song he remembered from his youth, one sung during victories long forgotten. He felt tears sting his eyes, not for the city, but for the people, for their endurance, for their ability to find music even in ruin. He knelt beside the woman and offered her a piece of bread, and she smiled, a small human kindness in a world undone. As the night deepened, the moon rose pale and distant, its light touching the Tiber and the shattered stones. Across the city, shadows moved where life still clung on. In the temples, priests lit new candles from the remnants of the old. In the courtyards, a few soldiers buried their comrades in silence. No speeches, no glory, just quiet respect. Rome, in its death, had begun to show a kind of grace it never had in life. Stripped of power, stripped of pride, it was finally human again. Alaric stood at the gates of the city, looking back one last time. He had done what history would remember, but he felt no triumph, only the weight of what it meant. He whispered to himself, "Empires fall, but people endure." And then he turned away, his army following him into the dark. The gates of Rome stood open behind them, creaking in the wind, the eternal city no longer guarded by soldiers, no longer proud, but still standing, wounded, quiet, and waiting for whatever history would make of its ashes.
Morning after Alaric's departure, the city was left in a silence that felt older than time itself. No horns, no marching feet, no cries of fear, only the faint sound of the wind moving through empty streets. The smoke had begun to clear, revealing the scars of the night before. The temples stood open to the sky. The statues of emperors lay toppled in the dust. The great Colosseum, once filled with the roar of crowds, now echoed only with the sound of crows circling above. Rome had survived, but it was not alive. It breathed like a body without a heartbeat. In the shadow of a broken archway, the old soldier sat watching the sun rise. He had not slept. His hands were covered in soot, his eyes hollow. He had seen wars before, but never like this. This was not the loss of land or power, it was the loss of meaning. He looked at the horizon and thought of the men who had built this empire, of the battles fought in its name, of the generations who had believed it would last forever, and he whispered, "We thought we were gods, but we were only men, and men cannot build eternity." In the center of the city, a group of survivors began to gather, men and women, nobles and slaves, all stripped of their differences by ruin. They moved carefully through the rubble, lifting fallen stones, pulling out the wounded, sharing water and scraps of bread. The empire had fallen, but something else had taken its place, something small, fragile, and human: compassion. The same people who once lived under laws written in gold now lived by instinct and kindness, and somehow that felt more real than the empire ever had. At the edge of the river, the priest who had survived the night stood beside the ruins of his church. He lifted a charred piece of wood and drew a cross in the ashes. Then he turned to the few who had followed him and said softly,
Rome has burned before, and it will burn again, but every time something is reborn from the flame. His voice carried on the wind, mixing with the rustle of the trees and the low murmur of the Tiber. The people listened, not because he was powerful, but because they of Levalor needed to believe that this was not the end. As the sun climbed higher, the light spread across the ruins, touching the broken walls, the scattered coins, the cracked marble floors, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the city was breathing again, wounded but still alive. Rome had fallen, but its story was still being written, not in marble or empire, but in the hearts of those who refused to let its memory fade. As the days passed, the smoke drifted away, and the air over Rome began to clear. But what it revealed was not the city that had once ruled the world. It was something quieter, humbler, the bones of greatness stripped bare. The streets that once carried armies now held only silence. The fountains that once sparkled with marble beauty were dry and filled with ash. And yet, here and there, small signs of life began to return. A merchant sweeping the dust from his doorstep, a child chasing a stray. Dog through the ruins, a priest lighting a candle in a church with no roof. Rome, it seemed, refused to die completely. The old soldier spent his mornings walking through the city, his steps slow, his gaze steady. He passed the fallen columns and shattered gates, touching them as if they were the faces of old friends. Every stone had a story. Every crack held a memory. He could almost hear the echoes of the past, the march of legions, the laughter of markets, the voices of senators arguing beneath the marble domes. It all seemed to hang in the air like ghosts that refused to leave. He whispered to them, "You did not fall in vain, because as long as we remember, you still live." In the forum, survivors began to gather once more, not to trade, but to talk, to share food, to plan. They spoke not of empire or glory, but of rebuilding. One woman suggested planting crops in the open courtyards. Another offered to teach the children who had lost their parents. Slowly, the ruins began to change, not through power, but through persistence. Where statues once stood, gardens began to grow. Where soldiers once marched, children now played. The city, in its brokenness, was becoming something new, something gentler. Alaric's army had long since moved north, but stories of the sack of Rome spread across the world. Some spoke of it with horror, others with awe, and some with a strange kind of reverence. For even in its fall, Rome had left a mark deeper than any victory. It was a reminder that nothing, not even empires, are beyond the reach of time. And yet, in that truth, there was something beautiful, the idea that from every ending, a new beginning waits quietly in the ashes. As night fell again over the quiet city, the old soldier sat by the river, the water reflecting the pale light of the moon. He closed his eyes and listened to the gentle flow, to the faint rustle of leaves, and for the first time in many nights, he felt peace. He whispered, "The empire is gone, but Rome remains, not in marble, not in kings, but in us, in our will to endure, in our need to remember." And the wind carried his words across the ruins, a soft echo that faded into the darkness, joining the countless voices of history that would never truly be silent.
By the 13th dawn after the fall, the city began to find its rhythm again. Not the rhythm of empire or conquest, but of survival. Smoke still clung to the air in thin wisps, the stones of the Colosseum were blackened, and the temples stood open to the sky. But there was life among the ruins. Merchants returned to the streets with carts full of salvaged goods. Women gathered water from the Tiber. Children played among the broken columns as if they were part of a new playground built by history itself. The sounds of living, faint and fragile, replaced the echoes of death. The old soldier walked through the heart of the city, where the Forum once gleamed with marble, now covered in dust and rubble. And yet, in that ruin, he saw something strangely beautiful. People working together, sharing bread, rebuilding what they could. No orders, no generals, no emperor, just humanity, pure and unguarded. For the first time in his life, Rome belonged not to the powerful, but to the people. He stopped to help lift a fallen beam, his arms shaking from age, and when a young man offered him water, he smiled. Maybe this is how empires should end, not with kings, but with kindness. Afar, in a quiet quarter near the baths, a small group of monks had begun to gather books from the ashes, scrolls and parchments half burned, names half erased. They carefully carried them into a cellar, whispering prayers as they did. They knew what these writings meant, the memory of Rome, its wisdom, its words, its soul. They would keep them safe. Even if the empire itself was gone, history would not die, not if they could help it, and in that simple act, the seed of a new world was planted, the first quiet step toward what the future would later call rebirth. As the sun set, the light turned golden, soft and forgiving. It fell across the ruins and made them glow.
as if the city, in all its brokenness, was finally at peace with itself. The old soldier climbed the steps of what remained of the capital. From there he could see the rooftops, the river, the hills beyond. He stood in silence for a long moment, breathing in the cool air, his heart heavy but calm. The empire was gone, but life remained. He whispered into the wind, "We were never eternal, but sure, maybe that was never the point. Maybe the beauty was in the struggle itself." The wind carried his words across the empty streets, through the broken archways and quiet courtyards, and for a moment it felt as if the city heard him, as if the spirit of Rome itself, tired but unbroken, listened and nodded in the fading light. The eternal city, no longer eternal in power, but eternal in memory, stood quietly against the setting sun. The nights that followed were quieter. The sound of hammers and voices now replaced the cries of despair. Rome was changing, not rising again as an empire, but as something smaller, more human. The flames had taken the marble and the gold, but what remained was the heart, stripped of pride, stripped of power. It beat softly beneath the ashes, in the hands of those who refused to leave, those who still called the ruins home. The air was cooler now, and the smell of smoke had begun to fade. The city was breathing again, slowly, painfully, but surely. In the ruins of the old palace, where emperors once ruled, families now gathered for warmth. The grand halls that once echoed with decrees now rang with laughter, the kind that comes from simply being alive. Children played where guards once stood, their bare feet slapping against cracked marble. Mothers told stories by the fire, not of gods or kings, but of courage and love, and the old soldier sat among them, silent, smiling faintly. He had never imagined the palace as a home, but now it felt more real than it ever had when it belonged to the empire. Down by the river, fishermen cast their nets again, their boats gliding across the dark water. The Tiber carried reflections of the broken city, like memories floating in motion, and above it all, the moon shone softly, as if forgiving the world for its destruction. The priest from the ruined church stood at the edge of the water, his hands clasped, his voice quiet. He prayed not for restoration, but for endurance, not for glory, but for peace, because he understood now that what had fallen is never meant to last, that maybe every empire must burn so that humanity can begin again. Alaric's name spread across the lands, carried by rumor and fear, but also by respect. Some called him a destroyer, others a messenger of fate, but few understood what he had truly done. He had not only ended an empire, he had forced the world to remember its mortality, and in that there was something almost sacred. Far to the north, he too sat by his campfire, staring into the flames, thinking of the city that had fallen and the faces he could not forget. He whispered into the night, "I did not destroy Rome. Time did. I only set it free." And so, under the quiet stars, Rome slept, not in triumph, not in ruin, but in transformation. The city that had once ruled the world was now a cradle of rebirth, its power gone, its spirit alive, and though the empire was no more, something greater had taken its place, the human will to endure, to rebuild, to remember, and in that will, the soul of Rome would live forever.
The 15th day came with a strange calm, the kind that feels like the world holding its breath. The sun rose over the hills, soft and golden, touching the ruins with warmth instead of fire. The smoke was gone now. The air smelled of dust and river water, and for the first time since the fall, birds returned, their faint songs echoing through the empty courtyards. It was as if life itself had decided to come back, not to restore the old, but to begin something new. Rome was no longer the marble and command. It was a city of survivors, of small voices rising from the quiet. The old soldier sat near the forum, his back against a broken pillar, watching as people worked together to clear the debris. He saw a boy helping an old woman lift stones, a girl filling a bucket from a cracked fountain, the same fountain where, years ago, senators once made speeches to crowds that cheered and bowed. Now there were no speeches, no orders, just hands building, one stone at a time, and he smiled. He thought of the legions, of the marches, of the wars that had stretched across the world, and realized that maybe this simple act of survival was the greatest victory of all. Across the river, the priest rang a small bell, calling the people to gather, not for mass, not for ceremony, but for remembrance. The survivors came, carrying candles, small lights that flickered against the early evening air. They stood in silence, their faces tired but peaceful, and one by one they placed their candles on the water. The flames floated gently down the Tiber, hundreds of tiny lights drifting through the city, reflections dancing on the dark waves. It was not a funeral. It was a promise that they would not forget, that the story of Rome would live even if the empire itself was gone. The old soldier watched the lights pass by, his eyes glistening. He whispered softly, "This is what remains. Not the armies, not the gold, not the glory, but the people, the memory, the will to go on." And as he spoke, a child tugged at his sleeve and offered him a candle. He took it, his hands trembling, and placed it in the river, watching it float away, carried by the current toward the unknown. And for the first time in a long while, his heart felt light. As night fell, the city glowed faintly with the light of the candles on the water. The ruins shimmered in the reflection, and the stars above seemed to bend lower, listening. The empire had ended, but in that quiet, gentle light, something greater was born, not of conquest, but of connection, not of rule, but of remembrance. And in that moment, Rome was eternal again, not in power, but in spirit. The 16th dawn came with a soft wind, carrying the smell of rain and new earth. The sky above Rome was gray, but not with smoke. This was the clean gray of clouds before a storm, a cleansing kind. The streets, though still scarred, began to feel alive again. Faint voices echoed through the ruins, the clatter of tools, the laughter of children, and the rhythm of footsteps, slow and steady. Rebuilding brick by brick, the city that had once ruled the world was now learning to be humble, to survive. And in that humility, there was a quiet strength that even empires never truly understood. The old soldier woke early and walked through the forum, his boots kicking up the dust of centuries. He looked at the broken temples, the fallen statues, the empty spaces where greatness once stood, and instead of sorrow, he felt peace, because he saw life returning, wildflowers growing between the cracks of marble, vines crawling up the walls that had once held banners of power, nature reclaiming what man had once tried to own. He smiled faintly and whispered, "The earth forgets nothing, it only waits, and now it is taking back what was always hers." In the ruins of the palace, people had made homes, children ran through the same halls that once echoed with the footsteps of emperors, their laughter bouncing off the old stones. Women cooked meals over small fires, men worked to mend walls, and for the first time in centuries, the palace was filled not with fear or pride, but with warmth, the sound of life. The city had changed, and yet in some way it had never been more real. The priest walked among them, offering blessings, his robes torn, his hands blackened by ash, but his voice steady. He said to them, "This is Rome now, not the empire, but the people, not the crown, but the heart." As the rain began to fall, gentle and cool, it washed over the ruins, over the streets, over the statues that still stood half broken. The drops carried away the dust and soot, revealing the pale stone beneath. It was as if the heavens themselves were cleansing the city. The old soldier stood in the rain, lifting his face to the sky, his armor cold against his skin, his eyes closed, and for a moment he felt the world become still. He whispered to himself, "It is done, not as an ending, but as a good truth," because what had fallen was only one chapter of a story that would never truly end. As the rain softened and the clouds began to part, a ray of sunlight broke through, shining on the river, on the rooftops, on the faces of those who remained, and in that golden light, the city seemed to breathe again. Tired, scarred, but alive, the empire had died. But Rome, in its simplest, truest form, was still here, standing quietly beneath the endless sky, waiting for history to begin again.
As the 17th dawn arrived, the world around Rome began to shift. The birds that had vanished during the smoke and chaos had returned, their wings cutting through the morning light. The river ran clearer now, washing away the ashes that once floated upon it, and the scent of earth after rain filled the air. The city looked broken. Yes, but not dead. The empire that had stretched from the sands of Africa to the forests of Britain was gone. Yet in its silence, there was a strange kind of harmony, a rhythm of rebirth whispering through the ruins. The old soldier walked once more through the heart of Rome, his steps slower now, his sword long gone, his back bent with time. He no longer saw the glory that had been lost, but the beauty of what had survived, a woman planting herbs where the Senate once stood, children laughing beside the cracked fountains, a young man carving wood near the ruins of the Forum. Life had taken the place of empire, and he realized, perhaps for the first time, that this was the true victory, not to rule, but not to conquer, but to continue. The soul of Rome, it seemed, had never been in its power, but in its people. Far beyond the walls, travelers came again, merchants carrying spices and cloth, monks bearing scriptures and stories. They came not to serve the empire, but to share, to learn, to rebuild connections that war had severed. And as they entered the city, they saw not the capital of a fallen power, but a cradle of memory, a place where the old world had ended and the new one had quietly begun. The priest greeted them with a smile, saying, "Welcome to Rome, not the eternal city of emperors, but the eternal city of hope." That night, as the fires burned low and the stars shimmered above, the old soldier sat by the river, his reflection trembling in the gentle current. He thought of all he had seen, of the battles, the triumphs, the losses, the fall. And now, this quiet peace, he spoke softly to the darkness. We built walls to protect ourselves. We built empires to prove our power. But in the end, what saved us was neither. It was our will to begin again, and as the wind brushed against his face, it felt like the city was listening, answering with a silence filled with meaning. The moon rose higher, painting the ruins in silver light, and the city seemed to glow, not with grandeur, but with grace. The world had turned, the empire had ended, but Rome, in spirit and in memory, still breathed beneath the stars, a reminder to all who would come after that no empire, no matter how mighty, can outlive the heart of its people. As the 18th morning broke, the horizon glowed soft and pink, the sun rising over the 7 hills just as it had for centuries. But the light that fell upon Rome was new, gentler, warmer. The city still bore its scars, its walls cracked, its temples hollow. Yet beneath the ruin there was movement, quiet and constant, life threading its way through the ashes like grass through broken stone. The empire had ended, but the story had not. The world had changed, but Rome, in some strange way, had endured. The old soldier awoke to the sound of bells, not the great bronze ones that once signaled war or victory, but small ones, made by hand, their soft chime carrying through the morning air. He rose slowly, his joints aching, his breath steady, and stepped outside into the light. The city around him was alive. He saw bakers pulling bread from clay ovens, children chasing each other across the square, a man singing while repairing a cartwheel, and for the first time, the old soldier smiled without sadness, because this was what Rome had become, not a monument, but a heartbeat. He walked to the river and stood by the water's edge, the current flowing smooth and bright, the reflection of the city trembling across its surface. He thought of the legions he had marched with, the banners that once fluttered above the world, and how all of it had vanished into memory. But here, in this quiet morning, he felt no loss. Only peace, he whispered. Maybe this is what eternity truly means. Not endless power, but endless remembrance. Not ruling the world, but being remembered by it. And the wind carried his words gently across the river, as if the city itself were listening. Near the steps of the old temple, the priest gathered a small crowd. He spoke not of gods or kings, but of gratitude, he said. The empire has fallen, but its people remain, and that is enough. The crowd nodded, their faces calm, their hands clasped. The sound of prayer rose softly, not demanding, not desperate, but thankful, for survival, for mourning, for the chance to begin again. And in that sound, Rome was alive, more alive than it had ever been under crowns or swords. As evening descended, the sky turned to gold, and then to deep blue. Stars began to bloom above the ruins, flickering like the candles that floated once on the river. The old soldier sat beneath a broken arch and looked at the heavens. The wind brushed past him, carrying whispers of the past and promises of the future. He closed his eyes and smiled, because he finally understood. Rome had not fallen, it had transformed. Its empire had ended, but its spirit, its story, its soul would live as long as there were hearts to remember it, and beneath that endless sky, the eternal city slept, not in ruin, but in peace.